The Ship of Theseus. You're sitting on your couch, scrolling through your phone, and suddenly you realize your favorite old pair of sneakers has a hole in it. No big deal, right? You swap out the laces, patch the sole, maybe replace the insoles. A few months later, the stitching comes loose, so you get that fixed too. Eventually, every single part of those sneakers has been replaced. The question is this: are those still the same sneakers you bought years ago? Or are they now something completely different? This is the kind of everyday puzzle we usually do not think about. Most of us just treat objects as the same thing as long as they serve the same purpose. A chair is a chair, even if we fix a broken leg or repaint it. A phone is still your phone, even after a screen replacement. But if you keep replacing parts long enough, when does the original stop being the original? At what point is it a new thing entirely? This is a question that has puzzled philosophers for centuries, and it is best captured by something called the Ship of Theseus. Now, do not worry if that name sounds like something out of a complicated history book. Let me break it down for you. The Ship of Theseus is a thought experiment, which is just a fancy term for a mental puzzle. It asks us to think about the nature of identity. The story goes like this. Theseus, a hero from Greek mythology, had a ship that was kept in Athens as a sort of monument. Over time, as the ship aged, parts of it began to rot and needed to be replaced. Plank by plank, sail by sail, rope by rope, everything on the ship was eventually swapped out with new materials. After enough years, not a single original piece remained. And here comes the big question. Was that ship still the same Ship of Theseus, or was it a completely different ship? The debate does not stop there. Some versions of the story say that all the old parts were gathered up and reassembled into another ship. So now you have two ships. One made entirely of the original materials, and one made entirely of replacements. Which one, if either, is the true Ship of Theseus? This puzzle forces us to ask, what really makes something what it is? Is it the materials it is made from? Or is it the continuity of its history, the way it carries on through time? This might sound like an abstract problem, but it actually connects deeply to our everyday lives. Think about your body. Scientists say that most of the cells in your body get replaced over the years. Skin cells, blood cells, even many parts of your bones are constantly renewing. So if your body today does not contain the same cells it did 10 years ago, are you still the same person? Or consider technology. If you have owned a computer or a smartphone for a long time, chances are you have replaced the charger, maybe the battery, maybe even the entire screen. Do you still think of it as your original device? Or is it basically a new one? This question also appears in relationships and identity. People often say, "I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago." And in a way, they are right. Our personalities shift, our interests change, our beliefs evolve. But despite those changes, we still feel like we are ourselves. The Ship of Theseus helps us think about what really makes us who we are. Is it our memories, our body, our choices, or some combination of all of those things? To bring this closer to the real world, let us look at an interesting example from the world of museums. In some art and history museums, you might find ancient objects that have been restored over time. A sword from the Middle Ages may have had its blade sharpened and polished. Its handle may have been replaced to preserve its usability. After enough changes, is that sword still the same sword a knight once held, or is it more like a replica? Museums face this dilemma all the time. They want to preserve history, but sometimes preserving means replacing, and replacing raises questions about authenticity. There is also a fascinating modern twist to the Ship of Theseus. Imagine digital files. If you copy a photo from your computer to a flash drive, and then from that flash drive to another computer, and so on, the original file is not really moving anywhere. What you end up with is a perfect duplicate. But if every copy is identical, which one is the real photo? Does the idea of an original even make sense in the digital world? The Ship of Theseus shows up in these conversations about technology, identity, and authenticity more often than you might think. Philosophers have debated this puzzle for centuries, and there are two major ways people usually answer it. Some say that the identity of an object lies in its physical material. If you replace all the parts, it is not the same anymore. Others argue that the identity lies in the continuity of its existence. Even if every plank on the ship was swapped, it is still the Ship of Theseus because it has the same history and purpose. Neither answer is perfect, and maybe that is the point. The thought experiment is designed less to give a clear solution and more to make us think deeply about how we define identity. This puzzle has even shown up in pop culture. For example, if you watch the Marvel series WandaVision, you might remember the famous scene where two versions of the character Vision debate the Ship of Theseus problem. One Vision had the body, but none of the memories, while the other had the memories, but not the original body. Which one was the true Vision? This is exactly the kind of question the Ship of Theseus wants us to wrestle with. At the end of the day, the Ship of Theseus is not just about old boats or worn-out sneakers. It is about how we see ourselves, how we define what is real, and how we make sense of change. It reminds us that identity is not always as simple as we think. Whether we are talking about objects, technology, or even our own lives, the question remains, what makes something truly itself? Maybe it is the materials, maybe it is the history, or maybe it is a mysterious mix of both. So the next time you replace a part of something you love, whether it is your favorite sneakers, your laptop, or even your car, take a moment to wonder, if you keep swapping parts long enough, when does it stop being the old thing and become something entirely new? That is the power of the Ship of Theseus. It turns everyday situations into deep questions about life, change, and identity. And maybe, just maybe, the real answer is not about the ship at all. Maybe it is about us, the ones asking the question. After all, we are constantly changing too, and yet somehow we still feel like ourselves. The Chinese room. Imagine walking into a restaurant in a foreign country where you do not speak a single word of the local language. You sit down, open the menu, and all you see are strange characters you cannot make sense of. The waiter comes over, smiles, and asks you something in that same language. You panic a little because you do not understand, but then you notice a little guidebook on the table. The guidebook tells you that when someone says a phrase that looks like this, you should respond with a phrase that looks like that. You have no idea what the words mean, but if you follow the guidebook step by step, you can still place an order, answer questions, and maybe even sound like you know the language. To everyone around you, it looks like you are fluent, but deep down, you know you are just matching symbols without any real understanding. This is something most of us have probably experienced at least once. Maybe you copied a math formula in school without really knowing why it worked. Or maybe you learned a phrase in another language that you could say perfectly but could not actually explain. In those moments, it feels like we are going through the motions without really grasping the meaning behind them. And that brings us to one of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy and artificial intelligence. It is called the Chinese room. Before diving into the details, think about how we often treat technology. Many of us assume that if a computer can answer questions, play chess, or even write poetry, then it must actually understand what it is doing. We might even find ourselves saying that the computer is smart, or that the chatbot knows what we are asking. But here is the catch. Is there a difference between processing information and actually understanding it? That is exactly what the Chinese room forces us to think about. So let us explain what the Chinese room is. Back in the year 1980, a philosopher named John Searle came up with this idea to challenge the way people thought about artificial intelligence. At the time, there was a growing excitement about computers being able to think like humans. Some researchers believed that if a program could manipulate symbols in the right way, then that meant it could truly understand language. Searle was not convinced. His thought experiment goes like this. Imagine a person who does not know any Chinese at all. This person is sitting inside a locked room. Inside the room, there are stacks of papers with Chinese characters on them, along with a giant rulebook written in English. The rulebook is basically an instruction manual that says, when you see a character that looks like this, you should respond with a character that looks like that. Now people outside the room write questions in Chinese on slips of paper and pass them into the room. The person inside carefully follows the rulebook, finds the right responses, and passes the slips of paper back out. To the people outside, it looks like the person inside is fluent in Chinese. They ask questions and get perfectly sensible answers in Chinese. But the truth is, the person inside has no idea what the characters mean. They're only manipulating symbols based on the rulebook. That, in a nutshell, is the Chinese room. It is a way of showing that just because a machine can appear to understand something does not mean it actually understands it. The person in the room is like a computer. They are processing inputs and giving outputs, but they do not have any awareness or comprehension of what those symbols really mean. Why does this matter? Well, think about how we use artificial intelligence today. We have chatbots, virtual assistants, and recommendation systems that can all produce human-like responses. They can generate stories, answer trivia, and even hold conversations. But the Chinese room reminds us that these systems might not truly understand anything at all. They are following rules and patterns, not grasping meaning the way humans do. To make this more relatable, imagine teaching a parrot to say, "I love you." The parrot can repeat the words perfectly, and when you hear it, you might even feel that the bird understands what it is saying. But does it really? Probably not. It is just mimicking sounds it learned from you. In the same way, a computer program can generate sentences that seem meaningful, but it might only be shuffling symbols without comprehension. Searle used this idea to argue against what is called strong artificial intelligence. Strong artificial intelligence is the belief that a computer running the right program does not just simulate understanding, but actually has a mind in the same sense that humans do. Searle thought that was wrong. According to him, computers can simulate understanding, but they do not and cannot truly understand because they are only manipulating symbols without any awareness of what those symbols mean. Now here is where it gets even more interesting. Some people agreed with Searle, while others strongly disagreed. Critics argued that maybe the person inside the room does not understand Chinese, but the system as a whole might. In other words, it is not just about the individual pushing papers around. It is about the combination of the person, the rule book, and the entire setup. That system could be said to understand Chinese, even if the individual inside does not. This debate is still ongoing, and it raises really deep questions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness. So why should you care about a thought experiment from over 40 years ago? Because it affects how we think about our relationship with technology today. When you talk to a chatbot, should you think of it as a tool or as something with its own understanding? When we design machines that appear human-like, are we creating partners, or are we just building clever parrots? And perhaps, most importantly, how should we treat these systems ethically if they never actually experience or understand anything at all? The Chinese room does not give us all the answers, but it gives us a powerful lens to think about these questions. It forces us to look beyond appearances and ask what it really means to understand something. It challenges us to distinguish between performance and comprehension, between looking smart and actually being smart. So the next time you interact with an artificial intelligence program, remember the Chinese room. Ask yourself, is this system truly understanding me, or is it just following a very complicated rulebook, like the person in that locked room? That simple thought can change the way you see not just computers, but intelligence itself. And maybe, just maybe, it can make you reflect on the moments in your own life where you go through the motions without really understanding. Whether it is cramming for a test, memorizing lines, or copying steps from a tutorial. We've all been in our own little Chinese room at one point or another. The challenge is to step outside, to go beyond rules and symbols, and to reach for genuine understanding. Buridan's ass. You open your fridge late at night. On the left shelf, there is a slice of chocolate cake. On the right shelf, there is a slice of cheesecake. You love both equally. You stand there staring, not knowing which one to pick. Minutes go by, and instead of enjoying dessert, you are frozen in indecision. Before you know it, your ice cream in the freezer starts melting because the fridge door is open too long. Sound familiar? That moment when you cannot decide because both choices feel equally good or equally bad. That is exactly where today's story begins. We all struggle with indecision from time to time. Maybe it is about which Netflix show to start, which outfit to wear, or even what to order at a restaurant. Sometimes the decisions are small, but other times they are big, like choosing a college, picking a career path, or deciding whether to stay in a relationship. When both options seem equally balanced, our brains almost lock up. We start weighing every tiny detail, and yet we cannot find a clear winner. This state of being stuck between two equally tempting or equally daunting choices has fascinated philosophers for centuries. One of the most famous illustrations of this problem is called Buridan's ass. Do not worry, it is not an insult. It is the name of a thought experiment that goes way back to the Middle Ages. The basic idea is simple. Imagine a donkey, hungry and thirsty, standing exactly in the middle between a pile of hay and a bucket of water. The donkey wants both food and drink, but it cannot decide which one to go to first because they are placed at equal distance. The poor donkey is stuck. Unable to choose, it ends up doing nothing at all and eventually starves and dies. Now, that might sound dark, but the point of the story is not to be cruel to donkeys. It is meant to show us something very real about human decision-making. When faced with two perfectly balanced options, logic alone might not help us act. The donkey represents us when we overthink, when we freeze, when we cannot move forward because both choices seem equally good or equally bad. But why does this matter? Because indecision can be surprisingly destructive in everyday life. Think about those moments when you put off answering an important email because you are not sure how to phrase it, or when you hesitate too long to buy a plane ticket and the price doubles, or when you cannot decide which career path to follow, so you keep waiting and waiting until opportunities pass by. The cost of indecision is real, and the longer we stay stuck, the more we risk losing. Buridan's ass helps us see this clearly. It reminds us that not making a choice is itself a choice, and often it is the worst one. Life rarely waits for us to figure everything out. The world moves forward whether we make a decision or not, and if we do not act, we might end up like that donkey, stuck in the middle, watching chances fade away. Interestingly, this idea connects to psychology as well. Researchers have studied something called decision paralysis. It is what happens when people are given too many equally appealing options. Instead of feeling free, they feel overwhelmed. For example, in one famous study, shoppers were offered a large selection of jams to taste. Another group of shoppers was offered only a few kinds of jam. Guess what happened? The people with fewer options were more likely to actually buy a jar. The ones with too many choices often walked away without buying anything. Too many equal options can leave us frozen, just like the donkey. History also gives us examples of this problem. Leaders and generals have sometimes failed because they could not commit to a single strategy. Armies have stalled, businesses have missed opportunities, and relationships have ended simply because people were unable to choose. Even great thinkers like Aristotle and Descartes wrestled with the question of how rational beings can make choices when two options seem equally balanced. So what does all this mean for us today? It means that Buridan's ass is not just an old philosophical puzzle. It is a mirror reflecting our daily struggles. The next time you find yourself staring at 2 job offers, 2 universities, or even 2 different pizzas on a menu, remember the donkey. Remember that staying stuck is often worse than making the wrong choice. Here is the good news. Real life is rarely perfectly balanced. If we look closely, one option almost always has a small advantage, even if it is tiny. Maybe one job gives you more flexibility. Maybe one slice of cake will make you happier in the moment. The trick is to notice those little differences and use them to tip the scale. Sometimes the best decision is simply to decide, even if it is not the perfect one. Action beats paralysis. There is also something to be said about intuition. While philosophers focus on logic, real people often rely on gut feelings, that sense in your chest that says, I think I will go this way. Intuition can be a way out of paralysis, a reminder that not every decision needs to be a mathematical calculation. Sometimes the best move is to trust yourself and take a step forward. Let us circle back to that fridge scenario. Standing there, staring at both cakes, you might feel torn. But instead of freezing, you could make a choice based on a tiny difference. Maybe the cheesecake looks fresher, or maybe the chocolate cake reminds you of your childhood. Either way, you pick one, close the fridge, and enjoy it. You acted, and in that moment, you avoided becoming Buridan's ass. At its heart, this thought experiment is a lesson about freedom. The donkey has complete freedom to choose, yet that very freedom becomes its trap. We as humans face the same danger. Having choices is wonderful, but without the courage to choose, freedom becomes a burden. Learning to decide, even when options are balanced, is part of what makes us resilient and capable. So the next time you feel stuck between 2 options, remember the donkey that starved, not because it lacked resources, but because it lacked decision. Remember that waiting forever for perfect certainty is usually worse than taking a step forward with imperfect knowledge. Life rewards action, and even if you make the wrong choice, you can always learn, adjust, and keep moving. Buridan's ass is more than an old story about a donkey. It is a timeless reminder that indecision can be deadly, not just for donkeys, but for dreams, opportunities, and the lives we want to live. So choose, act, and move forward. Because in the end, any decision that gets you unstuck is better than standing frozen in the middle of 2 cakes, 2 jobs, or 2 paths. The experience machine, Nozick. You wake up tomorrow morning, and sitting right next to your bed is a brand new machine. It looks sleek, futuristic, almost like something straight out of a science fiction movie. On top of it is a little note that says, "Step inside and you will experience the happiest life possible. No bills, no heartbreaks, no awkward social encounters where you wave at someone who is not waving at you. Just pure happiness. You could be a world-class athlete, a famous rock star, or even the genius who solves all of humanity's greatest problems. Everything you ever wanted, every dream you have ever had, could become your reality inside this machine. Sounds tempting, right? Now let's be honest. Most of us spend a lot of time chasing happiness in one way or another. We binge our favorite shows to escape stress. We scroll endlessly on social media, looking for laughs, validation, or inspiration. We daydream about winning the lottery, or finally reaching that perfect version of ourselves. And sometimes, we even find ourselves thinking, if only I could live in a world where everything went right, then I would finally be happy. It is a pretty common mindset, and it makes sense. Life is messy. It has ups and downs, and some days are just harder than others. So the idea of escaping into a world of guaranteed happiness is not only attractive, but also feels like the perfect solution. But here is where the twist comes in. Back in the 1970s, a philosopher named Robert Nozick came up with a thought experiment called the experience machine, and it asks us a really strange and uncomfortable question. If you could plug yourself into a machine that gives you a perfect life, would you do it? In other words, Would you choose a fake but blissful reality over the messy and uncertain real world? At first, it sounds like a no-brainer. Who would not want endless happiness? But once you think about it a little deeper, the question gets way more complicated. Let us break it down in simple terms. The experience machine works like this. Once you are plugged in, you will not know you're in the machine. Everything will feel absolutely real to you. If you want to feel the joy of climbing Mount Everest without training a single day, you can. If you want to experience being loved by millions of fans, you can. If you want to know the thrill of discovering a cure for a deadly disease, you can. The machine does not just give you random pleasures, it gives you the exact life you would want if you could design it yourself. The catch is that none of it is actually real. Your achievements, your relationships, your adventures, all of it would just be simulated experiences. They would feel real, but behind the scenes, you would just be floating in a tank, plugged into wires. So why does this matter? Because it forces us to think about what we actually want out of life. Is it happiness itself, no matter how it comes? Or is it something more? Something that has to do with truth, reality, and genuine experiences. This is the heart of Nozick's challenge. He argued that most of us would not actually choose to plug in, even if it promised endless joy. And that says something very deep about what we value. Think about it this way. Imagine you meet someone who says, "I am in love," and you ask them why. If they respond, "Because my brain is tricked into feeling loved by a machine," it would not sound very convincing, would it? There is a difference between the feeling of love and the reality of actually being loved by another person. In the same way, there is a difference between the feeling of accomplishment and actually accomplishing something. We seem to want the real deal, not just the illusion of it. Here is another angle. Imagine you are offered two options. In the first option, you live an ordinary life full of ups and downs. You struggle, you fail, but you also grow, learn, and experience genuine victories. In the second option, you live in the experience machine where everything is perfect, but none of it truly happened. Which would you pick? For many people, even with the promise of endless pleasure, the thought of giving up reality feels like too high of a price. That suggests that we value authenticity more than we value comfort. Nozick's thought experiment became famous because it highlights a tension that most of us feel but rarely put into words. We chase happiness, yet deep down, we want more than happiness. We want meaning. We want connection. We want to live in a real world where our choices matter, not in a simulation where everything is pre-programmed to give us satisfaction. And that raises a powerful point. If all we cared about was happiness, then yes, we should all plug into the machine. But the fact that most people hesitate shows that happiness alone is not enough. We crave reality. Now, you might be wondering, has anyone ever tested this idea in real life? And while we do not have actual experience machines lying around, we do have modern examples that come pretty close. Think about virtual reality. People can already step into digital worlds where they can live out fantasies, fight dragons, or attend concerts without leaving their room. Think about social media filters that let us present a polished version of ourselves, creating the illusion of a perfect life. Or even think about video games where we can build entire universes and live second lives. These are not as extreme as Nozick's machine, but they point in the same direction. And interestingly, even when people spend hours in these virtual spaces, most of them still come back to reality because they know something important is missing. So what does all of this mean for us today? The experience machine is not just a quirky thought experiment from a philosopher decades ago. It is a mirror that reflects our own desires and struggles. It asks us, do we value happiness above all else? Or do we value truth and reality even more? Do we want a life that feels good or a life that is real, even if it is messy? And maybe the bigger lesson is that if we find ourselves chasing happiness at all costs, we should pause and ask whether what we are chasing is authentic, because in the end, happiness without reality might not be what we truly want. So the next time life feels difficult, and you wish there were a shortcut to joy, remember Nozick's machine. Ask yourself, would I really want to trade the real for the fake if the fake felt just as good? Your answer might tell you more about yourself than you expect. The prisoner's dilemma. Imagine you and your best friend just got caught sneaking into an amusement park after hours. The security guard takes you both into separate rooms and says this: "All right, here's the deal. If you both stay quiet, I will only give each of you 1 night in detention. But if one of you rats the other out while the other stays silent, the one who talks gets to go free, while the one who stays quiet gets 5 nights. However, if you both rat each other out, then you both get 3 nights. You are sitting there thinking, do I stay loyal to my friend or do I save myself? This is the classic setup of the prisoner's dilemma. And the funny part is, even though it sounds like some dramatic scene out of a movie, it actually explains how humans, businesses, and even countries behave every single day. Now here is the thing. People often like to think they are loyal, rational, and fair. We tell ourselves, of course I would never betray my friend, I am trustworthy. But when push comes to shove, when there is something on the line like punishment or reward, our brains get a little messy. Suddenly the voice in your head whispers, wait a second, what if my friend betrays me first? I do not want to look like a fool. Maybe I should betray him before he betrays me. This is not just paranoia. It is a problem almost everyone faces at some point. We struggle with balancing what is best for us personally with what is best for the group. So let's make this simple. The prisoner's dilemma is a thought experiment in game theory. And no, game theory does not mean it has anything to do with video games or board games. Game theory is the study of how people make decisions when the outcome depends not only on what they do, but also on what someone else does. The prisoner's dilemma is the most famous example of this. At its core, it is about trust, betrayal, and the tricky balance between cooperation and selfishness. In the prisoner's dilemma, the logical choice for each person is to betray. Why? Because no matter what the other person does, betrayal seems safer. If your friend stays quiet, you go free by betraying. If your friend betrays, you avoid the worst punishment by betraying too. The strange twist is that when both people betray, they end up worse off than if they had both stayed loyal. In other words, the rational choice leads to a worse outcome for everyone, while the risky choice of cooperation could have made life better for both. And this matters way beyond 2 imaginary prisoners. Think about it in real life. Imagine 2 competing companies that are deciding whether to keep prices high or to lower them. If they both keep prices high, they both make good money. But each one secretly thinks, if I lower my prices while the other keeps theirs high, I will steal all their customers. Of course, if they both lower their prices, they both lose profits. The rational move seems to be cutting prices. But if both companies do it, they both suffer. That is the prisoner's dilemma playing out in business. Or consider something as simple as chores in a shared apartment. If both roommates do their fair share, the place stays clean and everyone is happy. But if one roommate decides not to clean, while the other still does, the lazy one benefits without lifting a finger. The temptation to slack off can lead both of them to stop cleaning, and then the apartment becomes a disaster zone. Once again, cooperation would have been best, but mistrust leads to a messy outcome. The prisoner's dilemma is also at the heart of bigger issues like climate change. Countries around the world know that if everyone cooperates and reduces pollution, the planet becomes healthier for all. But there is always that nagging thought. If my country cuts emissions while others do not, we lose economically while they keep growing. That fear pushes countries to keep polluting, which hurts everyone in the long run. It is like a giant global version of 2 prisoners in separate rooms, wondering if they can trust each other. One of the most fascinating things about this dilemma is that it shows how our instincts can backfire. Humans are wired to protect themselves. Survival first, cooperation second. But in situations like this, the survival instinct can lead to worse outcomes than if we had trusted the other person. It is a perfect example of how being rational does not always lead to the best results. There was actually a very famous study that showed how people behave when faced with repeated versions of the prisoner's dilemma. In the 1980s, a political scientist named Robert Axelrod invited people to submit strategies for playing a computer tournament of repeated prisoner's dilemma games. One strategy, called tit for tat, turned out to be incredibly successful. The idea was simple: start by cooperating. If the other player cooperates too, keep cooperating. But if the other player betrays, then you betray next time as punishment. This approach showed that cooperation can thrive when there is a chance for repeated interaction. It proved that people are more likely to be good partners when they know they will meet again. In other words, trust builds over time, and relationships matter. That is why the prisoner's dilemma is not just some quirky thought experiment for philosophers. It is a mirror of real life. It shows up in marriages, friendships, business deals, politics, and even international diplomacy. Every time you have to decide whether to cooperate or look out only for yourself, you are playing a version of this game. Sometimes we win by trusting. Sometimes we get burned. But either way, it is part of what makes us human. So the next time you and a friend are facing a choice where you could either cooperate or betray, remember the lesson of the prisoner's dilemma. Acting purely in self-interest can feel smart in the moment, but cooperation often leads to better outcomes for everyone. And maybe, just maybe, loyalty and trust are not just noble ideals. They are also pretty practical strategies for building a better life together. The Sorites Paradox. Imagine you are standing in front of a giant jar filled with jelly beans. You reach in and pull out one. The jar still looks full. You take another one. Still looks full. You keep going, one by one. And each time, the jar seems to look almost the same. At what exact point does the jar stop being full and start being not full? Is it after you take out 50 jelly beans? 100? 1,000? Or maybe the very last one? That moment when the jar officially shifts from full to not full is surprisingly hard to pin down. And this little puzzle is at the heart of one of philosophy's trickiest and most fascinating thought experiments, the Sorites Paradox. Most of us do not spend much time questioning simple things, like when a head of hair becomes bald, or when a small pile of sand becomes a heap. We just kind of go with our instincts. If we see a person with no hair, we call them bald. If we see a huge mound of sand, we call it a heap. Easy, right? But if you start to really think about where the line is, it gets blurry fast. People usually assume these boundaries are clear, but the Sorites Paradox shows us they are not as clear as we think. So what exactly is this paradox? The Sorites Paradox, sometimes called the paradox of the heap, is a philosophical puzzle about vagueness. It comes from the Greek word soros, which means heap. The original version goes something like this. Imagine you have a heap of sand. If you remove just one grain of sand, you would still call it a heap. Removing one grain does not magically turn a heap into not a heap. But if you repeat this logic over and over, grain by grain, eventually you are left with only a single grain of sand. A single grain is definitely not a heap. Yet, if each step seemed fine on its own, how did we go from heap to not heap without noticing the exact moment it happened? That is the puzzle. Each tiny change seems harmless, but together they completely transform the situation. This paradox forces us to confront the way we use language and concepts. It makes us realize that many everyday categories we rely on are fuzzy, not precise. We like to think that words like bald, tall, rich, or poor have clear definitions. When you look closer, you see that there are grey areas where the words stop being sharp and start being vague. Why does this matter? Well, vagueness affects us in real life more than we realize. Take money, for example. At what point do we call someone rich? Is it when they have $1 million? $500,000? 10,000? If you slowly add money to someone's bank account, when exactly do they cross the line from not rich to rich? Different people will draw the line in different places. The same goes for calling someone tall. If you line up people by height, at what point do you start saying, now this person is tall? 5'10", 6 foot, 6'2"? Again, there is no universal line, only personal judgment. The Sorites Paradox shows us that many of our concepts are like sliding scales, not on and off switches. You might be thinking, all right, this is just a word game, who cares? But the implications go way beyond sand piles and jelly beans. For example, in law, deciding when something counts as harassment or when a certain level of pollution becomes harmful often relies on vague categories. In medicine, defining when someone moves from being healthy to being sick can be just as tricky. Even in personal relationships, you might wonder, when does a friendship cross the line into being something more? These are all Sorites-style problems. They remind us that life is full of fuzzy boundaries. One famous example of this paradox in action comes from debates about baldness. Picture someone with a full head of hair. Pluck one hair out. They are still not bald. Pluck another. Still not bald. Keep going, and logically, you would never reach the point where you can suddenly declare, now they are bald. But of course, in the real world, we do reach that point. The paradox exposes a tension between our logical reasoning and our everyday ways of speaking. Philosophers have wrestled with this puzzle for centuries. Some suggest that words like heap or bald simply do not have precise definitions, and that is okay. Others try to come up with systems to sharpen these vague terms into exact numbers. For instance, maybe a person is officially bald once they have fewer than 1,000 hairs. But that feels artificial, because our natural language does not work with strict cutoffs. Another approach says that truth itself can be fuzzy, that something can be sort of true and sort of false at the same time. This idea, called fuzzy logic, is even used in computer science and engineering, where machines have to deal with uncertain or gradual changes. You might be surprised to learn that this paradox even shows up in politics and ethics. When do small lies become serious dishonesty? When does bending the rules become outright corruption? Each small step seems harmless, but put together, they can lead to big consequences. The Sorites Paradox reminds us that change often happens gradually, and that is why we sometimes fail to notice when something important has shifted. There is also a psychological side to this. Humans are not great at spotting gradual change. Think about how people age. You do not notice someone getting older day by day, but if you compare their picture today to one from 10 years ago, the difference is obvious. The Sorites Paradox highlights this blind spot in our perception. It shows why slow and steady changes, like habits forming or the climate warming, can sneak past our awareness until the difference is undeniable. So what can we take away from all this? The Sorites Paradox is not just a brain teaser. It is a reminder that our world is full of fuzzy boundaries. It challenges us to think more carefully about how we use language, how we set standards, and how we recognize gradual change. Whether we are making personal decisions, writing laws, or just trying to understand the world, the paradox pushes us to be more thoughtful about where we draw our lines. In the end, the Sorites Paradox is both frustrating and fascinating. It shows us the limits of our words, the slipperiness of our concepts, and the strange way that tiny differences add up to big ones. So next time you're eating jelly beans, or walking past a sandy beach, or even noticing your hairline in the mirror, remember this paradox. Somewhere between one and many, between full and empty, between bald and not bald, there is a blurry zone that keeps philosophers and everyday people alike scratching their heads. And that blurry zone is where the Sorites Paradox lives. The Omnipotence Paradox. You are sitting at a buffet, staring at a mountain of food. The waiter tells you you can eat absolutely anything as much as you want with no limits. At first that sounds amazing. Infinite pizza, endless ice cream, unlimited fries. But then your brain kicks in and starts asking silly questions. Could you actually eat everything in the buffet at once? Could you eat so much that you are full and then still keep eating forever? And what happens when you get to that one impossible question? Can you make yourself too full to take even one more bite, but then somehow eat another bite anyway? Suddenly, the idea of being unlimited does not feel so simple. We all love the idea of something being all-powerful, superheroes, gods, even the fantasy of being able to snap our fingers and fix every problem. But if you really stop and think about it, being all-powerful is not just about strength. It raises a strange kind of puzzle that makes you wonder if the very idea even makes sense. This puzzle is something people have struggled with for centuries, and it is called the Omnipotence Paradox. Now, before that word scares you, let's slow down. A paradox is basically a brain teaser that seems like it should have an answer, but keeps tying itself into knots. And omnipotence is just a fancy word that means all-powerful. Put them together, and you get the paradox of being all-powerful. So what is the classic example? It usually goes like this. If a being is all-powerful, can that being create a rock so heavy that even they cannot lift it? If the answer is yes, then there is something they cannot do, which is lifting the rock. If the answer is no, then there is still something they cannot do, which is making the rock in the first place. Either way, it looks like being all-powerful has a limit. That is the paradox. Now, at first, this might just sound like a clever trick question, the kind of thing you might hear from that one friend who always wants to sound deep at 3 in the morning. But actually, this paradox has been taken seriously by philosophers, theologians, and even everyday people who wonder what it means for something or someone to be unlimited. Because if being all-powerful leads to contradictions, then what does it really mean to call someone all-powerful? Think about how this plays out in real life. When people say things like, "With hard work you can do anything," it sounds inspiring. But the truth is, we cannot literally do anything. We cannot breathe underwater without help. We cannot make ourselves fly by flapping our arms. We cannot both stay awake forever and also get a good night's sleep. There are real limits built into the way the world works. So when we talk about unlimited power, we are stepping into a territory that does not behave the way our normal experience tells us it should. This is why the omnipotence paradox matters. It forces us to ask whether the very idea of unlimited power is even possible, or if it is more of a poetic idea than a logical one. Some philosophers argue that being all-powerful does not mean doing what is logically impossible, like making a square circle or creating a rock too heavy to lift. Instead, they say it means having the power to do anything that can possibly be done. That explanation helps clear things up for some people, but others feel it just moves the problem around without really solving it. To make it more relatable, picture this. Imagine you are a video game developer. You design a game where the player can do anything. Sounds exciting, right? But then your testers come to you and say, "Hey, I tried to make my character exist and not exist at the same time, and the game crashed." Suddenly you realize that allowing absolutely anything creates contradictions that break the whole system. So you go back and add limits. The player can fly, sure, but they cannot both fly and fall at the exact same time. They can have endless lives, but they cannot both die forever and also keep playing. You end up with something that feels unlimited, but actually has rules in the background to make it work. That is basically how some thinkers approach the omnipotence paradox. One famous philosopher who tackled this was Thomas Aquinas, a medieval thinker whose writings shaped much of Christian theology. He argued that being all-powerful does not mean being able to do nonsense. For example, he said it would be nonsense to say that an all-powerful being can make a square circle. The very idea is contradictory. So in his view, the paradox does not weaken the idea of omnipotence because the question itself is flawed. Asking if an all-powerful being can make a rock so heavy they cannot lift it is like asking if a triangle can have 4 sides. It just does not make sense in the first place. On the other hand, other philosophers have pushed back and said, wait a minute. If you start adding limits, are you really still talking about being all-powerful? For them, the paradox is a reminder that maybe the concept itself is impossible to pin down. Maybe it is one of those ideas that sounds good in conversation, but falls apart when you look at it too closely. Even outside of philosophy, the paradox sneaks into our everyday thinking. Think about superheroes in movies. Writers often face the problem of making a character too powerful. If Superman can literally do anything, then the story has no tension. So writers introduce weaknesses like kryptonite, or they create impossible moral dilemmas that even unlimited strength cannot solve. In other words, they add limits, because without them, the character stops being interesting. The Omnipotence Paradox also shows up in how we think about leadership, technology, and even our own personal lives. For example, people often wish for complete freedom. No rules, no limits, just total control. But in reality, total control can lead to contradictions. If everyone had absolute freedom, then nobody could stop anyone else from taking that freedom away. Just like the rock that's too heavy to lift, the idea breaks itself from the inside out. So why does this paradox keep fascinating us? Because it touches on the deepest questions about power, limits, and meaning. Whether you are talking about gods, superheroes, or your own ambitions, the question of what it means to be unlimited forces us to confront the strange relationship between power and possibility. At the end of the day, the omnipotence paradox might not have a neat answer. It is less about solving the puzzle and more about realizing what the puzzle reveals. It shows us that language and logic can stretch only so far before they start to collapse. It reminds us that some ideas, no matter how inspiring, may live more in poetry and imagination than in strict reason. And most of all, it challenges us to think more carefully whenever we throw around the word anything. So the next time someone tells you that with enough willpower you can do absolutely everything, maybe smile and remember the buffet. You might be able to pile your plate sky high, but at some point even unlimited pizza has its limits, and that is exactly what makes the question of omnipotence so deliciously puzzling. Parfit's split brain. You wake up one morning and decide to make breakfast. With your right hand, you pick up a spoon to pour cereal into a bowl, but at the same time, your left hand reaches for the fridge and grabs the milk without you even thinking about it. Now that is normal teamwork between your two hands. But what if your left hand and your right hand started doing completely different things? Imagine your right hand trying to button up your shirt while your left hand is busy unbuttoning it. That sounds like a prank your own body is playing on you. But believe it or not, something very similar can happen in real life. And this strange situation opens up a deep and fascinating question about who you really are. Are you just one person? Or could you actually be more like two? Most of us go through life with a simple assumption. We think of ourselves as one whole individual with one mind. You wake up, you think, you feel, you act, all as one single person. It seems so obvious that we rarely question it. Sure, sometimes we feel conflicted, like part of us wants to eat cake while another part of us wants to stay healthy. But even then, we usually see those conflicts as happening inside one unified self. We think of the mind as a single control room with one operator in charge. But the truth is, the mind is far stranger and more complicated than that. In the mid-20th century, doctors and philosophers discovered something that challenges our very idea of identity. The discovery came from unusual medical cases involving people with what is called a split brain. These people became living puzzles, and one philosopher in particular, Derek Parfit, used these puzzles to raise mind-bending questions about who we are. So what is a split brain? Well, inside your head, you have two halves of the brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. They are connected by a thick bundle of nerves called the corpus callosum, which allows them to communicate. Think of it like a high-speed internet cable between the two sides. For most people, this connection means both halves of the brain share information seamlessly, so you experience the world as one unified person. But in the past, for patients with severe epilepsy, doctors sometimes cut this connection in order to reduce the violent seizures. The result was fascinating. These patients could still walk, talk, and live mostly normal lives. But under certain conditions, it became clear that the left brain and the right brain could act almost like two different minds trapped in the same skull. For example, if you showed one image to the left eye and a different image to the right eye, the patient's brain halves could process the images separately without sharing. If the left hemisphere saw a picture of a key, the patient could say out loud, "That is a key." But if the right hemisphere saw a picture of a ring, the patient might use the left hand to pick up a ring without being able to explain why. It was as if there were two centers of awareness, each with its own perceptions and even its own intentions. And here is where Derek Parfit comes in. Parfit was a British philosopher who loved using thought experiments to test our ideas of personal identity. He asked, if the left and right halves of the brain can operate independently, then what happens to the self? Is there still just one person? Or are there really two people sharing the same body? Parfit's split brain example makes us confront a deep mystery. Normally we think of ourselves as indivisible, like a solid block of identity, but the split brain shows that our unity depends on communication between the two hemispheres. Once that link is cut, things get blurry. You could say the person is still one, because after all, they continue to act as a single human being in daily life. But you could also say there are really two separate streams of consciousness, two centers of thought that just happen to share one body. Why does this matter? Because it challenges our assumptions about what it means to be a person. Think about it. When you make a promise, when you remember your past, when you plan for the future, you assume it is the same you that did, does, and will do those things. But if identity can be split, if the self is not a solid thing, but more like a pattern or a process, then maybe the way we think about responsibility, memory, and even survival needs to change. Parfit used this to argue that what matters most about survival is not strict personal identity, but psychological continuity. In other words, what matters is whether your memories, intentions, and thoughts continue, not whether some metaphysical thing called the self remains perfectly intact. For him, the split brain cases proved that the self is not as simple as we assume. To bring this closer to home, imagine you are playing a cooperative video game with a friend. Normally, the two of you are separate players with separate controllers. But imagine a glitch where the game forces both of you to share the same character on screen. Sometimes the character moves left when you press the button. Sometimes it moves right when your friend presses theirs. From the outside, it looks like one character, but inside the game, there are two different decision makers. That is a bit like what happens in a split brain. From the outside, it looks like one person, but internally, there may be two separate perspectives. One famous experiment really drives this home. A split brain patient was shown a snow scene with the right half of their brain and a chicken claw with the left half. When asked to pick related objects, the right hand, controlled by the left brain, pointed to a chicken. The left hand, controlled by the right brain, pointed to a shovel, because a shovel is used for snow. When asked to explain, the patient's left brain, which handles speech, said, "The shovel is for cleaning the chicken coop." That is not true. But the left brain had no access to the snow scene, so it made up a story to explain the choice. This shows just how separate and independent the two hemispheres can be, and how the sense of a single self may actually be a clever illusion. Parfit saw this not as a weird exception, but as a clue to how identity works in general. He argued that the self is not a deep, unchanging thing. Instead, it is like a collection of overlapping memories, intentions, and experiences. The split brain simply reveals this more clearly. It is like shining a flashlight on the cracks in what we thought was a solid wall. So, why should we care about all of this? Because it changes how we think about what it means to live and survive. If the self is not a single solid object, but rather a pattern of psychological continuity, then maybe what really matters is preserving those patterns, not clinging to the idea of a permanent self. This has implications for how we think about death, about moral responsibility, and even about the possibility of things like uploading consciousness in the future. In the end, Parfit's split-brain thought experiment shows us that identity is not as clear-cut as we want it to be. It invites us to rethink the everyday assumption that you are just one indivisible person. Instead, maybe you are more like a symphony of processes, all working together most of the time, but capable of surprising divisions when pushed. It is strange, it is unsettling, but it is also fascinating because it opens the door to understanding ourselves in a deeper and more flexible way. So the next time you find yourself in an inner conflict, like wanting to hit the snooze button while also wanting to get up early, remember this. Your mind may already be more like a community than a single ruler. And thanks to Parfit's split brain, we can start to appreciate just how rich, strange, and mysterious that community really is. The Swamp Man. Imagine you are out on a walk in the park, maybe enjoying the fresh air, when suddenly you trip on a tree root and drop your phone. You pick it up and realize something strange has happened. The phone looks exactly the same as before, but somehow all your pictures, your apps, and even your contacts are gone. On the outside, it is the same phone. On the inside, it feels completely different. Now imagine if that happened, not to your phone, but to you. What would it mean for who you are? Most of us do not spend much time thinking about our identity in that deep way. We are usually more concerned with practical things, like making it to work on time, paying bills, or deciding what to eat for dinner. We think of ourselves as continuous, stable people. The person who went to bed last night is the same person who woke up this morning, and the same person who is now watching this video. But is that always true? What exactly makes you, you? Is it your body, your brain, your memories, or something else entirely? This brings us to one of the strangest and most thought-provoking thought experiments in philosophy. It is called the Swamp Man. And once you hear it, you may never think about identity in the same way again. The Swamp Man scenario was introduced by the philosopher Donald Davidson in the 1980s. Here is the story. Imagine a man named Donald walking through a swamp. Out of nowhere, lightning strikes and completely disintegrates him. At the exact same time, another bolt of lightning strikes a pile of random swamp matter, like mud and sticks, and out of pure chance it rearranges into a perfect copy of Donald. This new being looks exactly the same, down to every cell and every molecule. He even has the same clothes, the same voice, and the same memories. From the outside, no one can tell the difference. Friends would greet him, he would remember their names, and he would act just like the original Donald. But here is the big question. Is this Swamp Man actually Donald? Or is he just a brand new person who happens to look and act like him? At first, you might say of course he is Donald. He has the same body and even remembers the same past. If he goes home to Donald's family, he will hug them, tell them he loves them, and they will believe it is truly him. But the philosopher Davidson argued that this new Swamp Man is not really Donald at all. Why? Because he was never shaped by Donald's actual history. He did not really live through those experiences. He did not actually learn those words, and his memories are not memories at all. They are just the accidental arrangement of swamp material that looks like memories. This thought experiment forces us to ask what identity really depends on. Is it our history and continuity through time, or is it just our physical structure and behavior? If a copy of you appeared right now with all your memories and personality, would that copy actually be you? Or would it only be a convincing imposter? To make this more relatable, think about when people back up their data to the cloud. If you lose your phone and download all your information onto a new device, is the new phone the same as your old one? Most people would say no, because the original is gone. It might be functionally the same, but it is not the very same object. Now replace the phone with yourself. That is what makes the swamp man puzzle so unsettling. Why does this matter? Well, it challenges the way we think about responsibility, relationships, and even meaning. If someone looks like your friend, talks like your friend, and remembers every moment you shared together, but was never actually that friend, would your relationship still be real? Or would it all just be an illusion? And if who you are depends on your history, then losing your memories or having them artificially replaced could mean losing your identity as well. This ties directly into real-world questions about memory loss, artificial intelligence, and cloning. For example, think about someone with severe amnesia who forgets their past entirely. We usually still consider them the same person, even though their memory is gone. So does that mean history is not necessary for identity after all? Or does it mean that the continuity of the body and brain is what keeps them the same person? The swamp man forces us to wrestle with those possibilities. A famous related story that shows this idea in action is the Ship of Theseus. The ancient Greeks told of a ship that was preserved for centuries. Over time, every plank of wood was replaced with a new one. Philosophers asked, is it still the same ship once none of the original material remains? Some say yes, because the structure and continuity remained. Others say no, because it is made of entirely new parts. The swamp man is like the Ship of Theseus, but with a living person. Instead of planks, it is memories, thoughts, and experiences. There are also connections to modern science fiction. Think about movies where a character is cloned, or where teleportation beams people from one place to another. If teleportation destroys the original body and creates a new one somewhere else, is that still the same person? Or is it just a perfect copy who thinks it is the original? Science fiction uses these scenarios to explore the very same questions that Davidson raised with the swamp man. At the end of the day, the swamp man does not give us clear answers, but that is what makes it powerful. It reveals how fragile our assumptions about identity really are. Most of us assume we are solid, continuous beings. But this thought experiment shows that maybe our identity is not just about our physical makeup or even our memories. Maybe it depends on the unique path we have taken through life, a path that cannot be duplicated by chance. So the next time you look in the mirror or scroll through old photos of yourself, you might wonder, what exactly makes you, you? Is it your body, your brain, your memories, or the story you have lived? And if by some strange twist of fate, a lightning strike created another version of you out of swamp mud, would that being really be you? Or would it be someone completely new, walking around with your face, your voice, and your history, but not your identity? The swamp man invites us to pause and reflect. It is not just a weird swamp story. It is a mirror held up to our deepest assumptions about existence. It challenges us to think about what it means to be the same person across time, and whether we are more than just the sum of our parts. And maybe, just maybe, it shows us that our lives are unique not because of how we look or act, but because of the one continuous journey only we have taken. The veil of ignorance. Rawls. Imagine you're about to throw the biggest party of your life. You're excited. But here is the catch. You have to plan everything. The food, the music, the seating, even the rules for who gets to eat first, without knowing whether you will be a guest of honor sitting at the main table, or one of the last people to arrive who has to sit in the corner next to the bathroom. You do not know if you will be rich or poor, tall or short, popular or quiet. You could end up as anyone at this party. How would you plan it then? You would probably want to make it fair, right? You would not set it up so that only the rich guests get the best food or that only the tallest people can see the stage. You would design it in a way where no matter who you turned out to be, you would still have a good time. This little thought experiment is a fun way to get into one of the most interesting ideas in philosophy. It is called the veil of ignorance, and it comes from the philosopher John Rawls. And although it sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, it is actually a tool for thinking about fairness, justice, and how we can create rules for society that everyone can live with. Now let's be real for a second. Most of us, when we make decisions, we cannot help but think about ourselves first. It is human nature. If you were designing a school and you happen to be an athlete, maybe you would want bigger gyms and more sports funding. If you were more into arts, you would probably want better music rooms or theatre programs. And if you were super rich, you might not be that worried about financial aid for students. We all look at the world from our own point of view, and that is fine most of the time. But when it comes to creating fair systems that affect everyone, our personal biases can get in the way. This is where Rawls comes in. John Rawls was an American philosopher who wrote a book called A Theory of Justice in the 1970s. In that book, he asked a big question. What would a truly fair society look like? To answer that, he introduced this idea of the veil of ignorance. It works like this. Imagine you are about to design the rules for an entire society. You get to decide everything. The laws, the rights, the economic system, all of it. But here is the twist. Before you make those choices, you have to put on the veil of ignorance. When you are behind the veil, you have no idea who you will be in that society once it is set up. You do not know if you will be rich or poor, healthy or sick, highly educated or not educated at all. You do not know your race, gender, religion, or even your talents. You could be anyone. Now think about that for a second. If you had to design a society without knowing whether you would end up at the top or the bottom, what would you do? Chances are you would want to make it fair. You would want rules that protect the weakest people, because you might be one of them. You would want equal opportunities, because you might be born without advantages. You would probably still allow differences, like some people might earn more because they work harder or have special skills, but you would not design a world where those at the bottom suffer unbearably. This is why the veil of ignorance matters. It gives us a way to step outside of our own bias and think about fairness in a more universal way. Instead of asking, what benefits me right now, we ask, what rules would I agree to if I did not know who I would be? That shift changes everything. Let's make it more concrete. Imagine you are creating rules for a school cafeteria. If you knew you would always be first in line, maybe you would not care if there was enough food for everyone. But if you had no idea whether you would be first or last, you would make sure there was enough food for all. And maybe you would design a fair rotation system, or think about traffic laws. If you knew you were always going to drive a fancy car with lots of safety features, maybe you would not care about strict speed limits. But behind the veil, since you might end up on a bicycle or walking, you would want rules that protect everyone equally. In real life, this concept has big implications. Politicians, lawmakers, and leaders can use the veil of ignorance to think about policies. For example, when deciding on healthcare, education, or taxation, the question becomes, would I agree to this system if I had no idea whether I would be rich or poor, healthy or sick? It forces a kind of moral imagination where we put ourselves in everyone's shoes at once. One of the famous parts of Rawls's theory is something called the difference principle. It basically says that inequalities can exist. Some people can have more wealth or more power, but only if those differences actually benefit the least advantaged people in society. For example, doctors might earn more money because their job requires a lot of training and skill, but that inequality is acceptable because their work benefits everyone, including the sick and vulnerable. A great way to see the veil of ignorance in action is to think about how kids play games. Imagine a group of children deciding the rules of hide and seek. If one kid makes the rules after already picking the best hiding spot, it is unfair. But if the rules are agreed on before anyone chooses their spot, then it is much more likely to be fair for everyone. The veil of ignorance is like agreeing on the rules before you know your place in the game of life. Another real-world example comes from debates about social programs. Some people argue against things like public healthcare or unemployment support because they personally might not need it. But behind the veil, You cannot guarantee you will always be healthy or always employed. Suddenly, these systems start to look like wise insurance policies for society as a whole. Of course, not everyone agrees with Rawls. Some critics say the veil of ignorance is too idealistic because people are not good at imagining themselves as someone completely different. Others argue that fairness does not always mean equality, but whether or not you agree with every detail, the thought experiment is powerful because it forces us to think differently. And maybe that is the real beauty of the veil of ignorance. It is less about giving us a final answer and more about challenging the way we usually think. Instead of asking, "What do I want?" it invites us to ask, "What would be fair for everyone, no matter who I turn out to be?" That shift in perspective can change how we look at politics, economics, and even personal decisions in our everyday lives. So the next time you are tempted to design things only from your own point of view, whether it is deciding how to split the last slice of pizza, planning a group project, or thinking about big social issues, try putting on the veil of ignorance, at least in your imagination. Ask yourself, if I did not know my role here, what would I want the rules to be? Chances are the answer will be fairer, kinder, and more just than you first expected. Because at the end of the day, none of us gets to choose where we are born or what circumstances we are given. But by thinking behind the veil, we can design a world that works better for everyone, no matter who they turn out to be. Mary's room, knowledge argument. Imagine this: you have never, ever tasted chocolate in your life. You have read every single fact about it. You know the chemical compounds that make it sweet, the history of how it spread across the world, the exact texture of the cocoa bean, and even the way people describe the taste. You could lecture at Harvard about chocolate. But here is the catch. You have never actually taken a bite. Now, if one day you finally taste chocolate, do you learn something new? Or did you already know everything there was to know? That is the puzzle we are talking about today. People often assume that if you have all the facts about something, then you truly understand it. Think about how we talk about experiences. Someone might say, "I know what heartbreak feels like," after reading about it in novels or listening to songs. But when they go through it for the first time, they suddenly realize, "Oh, this is completely different." Or take roller coasters. You can study how they work, the speed, the safety mechanisms, the loops, and the G-forces. But the first time you sit down, hear the click of the seatbelt, and feel your stomach drop, it is an entirely new experience. This gap between knowledge and experience is something we encounter every day, and yet we rarely think about it. This brings us to one of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy of mind, Mary's room, also known as the knowledge argument. It was introduced by philosopher Frank Jackson in the 1980s, and it raises a very simple but powerful question. Can knowing all the physical facts about something give you the full picture, or is there a kind of knowledge that only comes through direct experience? Here is how the story goes. Imagine Mary. Mary is a brilliant scientist who has spent her entire life in a black and white room. She has never seen colour. Her entire world is made of shades of grey. But here is the twist. Mary knows everything there is to know about colour vision. She has studied the wavelengths of light, how the eyes process those wavelengths, how the brain interprets them, and all the scientific details. She is basically the world expert on colour. Then one day, Mary leaves the room and sees a ripe red apple for the very first time. The big question is, does Mary learn something new when she sees the colour red? At first, you might think, well, of course not. She already knew everything about colour. But at the same time, it feels impossible to deny that when she actually sees red for the first time, she gains a brand new piece of knowledge. She now knows what it is like to experience red. This is what philosophers call qualia. Qualia are the subjective, first-person experiences we have. The way chocolate tastes to you, the way a violin sounds, the way the colour blue looks when you gaze at the ocean. These are not just facts you can list in a textbook. They are lived experiences. Why does this matter? Because Mary's room forces us to confront a huge question about the human mind. If Mary learns something new when she leaves the black and white room, then not all knowledge can be captured by physical facts alone. That suggests that our conscious experiences, the way things feel to us, might not be fully explained by science. And that shakes up the way we think about the mind, the brain, and even the possibility of artificial intelligence. Think about it in everyday terms. You might know all the statistics about sadness, the symptoms of depression, and the brain chemistry behind it, but none of that fully captures what it is like to feel sad yourself or think about music. A computer can analyze every note in a song, but does that explain why a certain melody makes you cry or gives you goosebumps? Mary's room highlights that there is a gap between objective knowledge and subjective experience. Philosophers have debated this for decades. Some argue that yes, Mary really does learn something new when she sees red. That means physicalism. The idea that everything can be explained by physical facts is incomplete. Others argue that actually she does not gain new knowledge. She only gains a new ability. In other words, before she saw red, she could not recognize or imagine it, but all the facts were already there in her mind. This back and forth makes Mary's room one of the most important thought experiments in the philosophy of consciousness. To see how this plays out in real life, consider virtual reality. Imagine a person who has read every manual about skydiving. They know the exact speed of freefall, how the parachute opens, and how the body feels pressure at high altitude. Now they put on a virtual reality headset that simulates the experience of jumping out of a plane. It looks real, it feels real, their stomach drops, and their heart races. Even though it is not actual skydiving, it gives them something they never had before, the feeling of what it is like. That is the difference between book knowledge and lived experience. Another way to see the importance of Mary's room is to look at how we teach. Think about learning to swim. You can read all the guides, watch YouTube tutorials, and memorize safety rules. But the first moment you actually get in the water, your body reacts in a way no amount of studying can prepare you for. The knowledge is important, but the experience is essential. That is exactly what Mary's room illustrates. There are certain things that can only be learned through direct encounter. Now, here is where it gets even more interesting. Some scientists and philosophers argue that Mary's room does not really prove that physical science is incomplete. Instead, they say it shows how complicated our brains are. Maybe Mary knew the facts, but she simply could not connect them until she had the experience. In that sense, it is not that science is lacking, but rather that the way humans process information is tied to experience. Others go further and say that subjective experience, qualia, might always remain outside the reach of science. It is something unique to consciousness itself. So where does that leave us? Well, Mary's room is not about finding a simple answer. It is about raising a profound question. Can facts ever fully capture what it is like to be human? It is a challenge to our understanding of knowledge itself. And it reminds us that there is a difference between knowing something and truly experiencing it. The next time you think you know something completely, ask yourself, do I really know it? Or have I just read about it? Because just like Mary, you might find that stepping outside your own black and white room reveals a whole new layer of reality you never expected. Brain in a vat. Imagine this for a second. You are sitting at your desk, maybe sipping on coffee, scrolling through your phone, watching this video. Everything feels normal. But what if I told you there is a small possibility that none of this is real? Not the coffee, not your desk, not even your body. What if you are actually just a brain, floating in a jar of liquid, hooked up to some powerful computer that feeds you the illusion of reality? I know, it sounds like the start of a weird sci-fi movie, but stick with me, because this thought experiment, known as brain in a vat, has been one of the most fascinating and unsettling ideas in philosophy for decades. We usually go through life without questioning the basics. You wake up, brush your teeth, eat breakfast, go to school, go to work, or hang out with friends. You rarely stop to think, wait a second, how do I actually know any of this is real? The thought feels strange and uncomfortable, so most of us push it aside. We assume that what our senses tell us is reliable. When you touch your phone, you feel its smooth surface. When you smell pizza, your stomach growls in agreement. When you hear music, you nod along. It all feels so solid, so undeniable. But philosophy loves to poke holes in that confidence, and the brain in a vat is a perfect example of how easily that certainty can be shaken. So what exactly is brain in a vat? Picture this. Somewhere in a hidden lab, a scientist has taken a human brain and placed it in a glass container filled with life-sustaining fluid. Wires and electrodes connect the brain to a supercomputer. This computer sends electrical signals into the brain, simulating all the experiences you would normally get from your body. The brain sees a world. It hears voices. It tastes food. It feels touch. But in reality, none of that is happening. The brain is trapped, living in a perfectly convincing illusion. At its core, the brain in a vat is a modern twist on an ancient philosophical problem. The question is, how can we ever be sure that what we experience is truly real? If all of our knowledge of the world comes through our senses, and if those senses can be fooled, then maybe we can never really know the difference between reality and a simulation. That is the unsettling power of the thought experiment. It asks us to imagine the possibility that our entire life might be no more than an elaborate trick of the mind. Now you might be wondering, why should anyone care about this? It sounds like a creepy idea you would hear at 3 a.m. during a late-night debate with your friends. But the brain in a vat matters because it pushes us to examine the foundation of our beliefs. You trust your senses every single day. You believe the world is real, other people exist, and your experiences matter. But if you cannot prove those assumptions, then what does it say about knowledge itself? Philosophy calls this skepticism, the idea that we might not truly know anything at all. Think about how this idea shows up in daily life. Virtual reality headsets already give us fake worlds that feel surprisingly real. Video games can trick your brain into feeling motion, speed, and even fear of heights when you're just sitting in your living room. Optical illusions fool your eyes into seeing shapes or colors that are not really there. Even dreams can feel so lifelike that when you wake up, you sometimes need a moment to separate dream from reality. All of these examples remind us that the line between reality and illusion is thinner than we like to admit. The brain in a vat takes that idea to the extreme. One of the most famous cultural examples of this thought experiment is the movie The Matrix. In the film, humans live inside a simulated world created by machines. Their bodies are asleep in pods, but their minds believe they are walking around in a real city, going to work, eating dinner, falling in love. Sound familiar? That is brain in a vat on a Hollywood scale. The movie did not invent the idea, but it brought it to mainstream audiences in a powerful way. When Neo asks, "What is real?" he's basically wrestling with the same philosophical question. If your mind can be tricked so completely, how can you ever know what is true? But this is not just about science fiction or philosophy classrooms. The brain in a vat can change the way you think about your everyday life. For one, it teaches humility. It reminds us that our perspective on the world is limited and our senses are not perfect truth machines. It also challenges us to look for deeper justifications for our beliefs. Maybe you cannot prove with absolute certainty that you are not a brain in a jar, but you can still find practical reasons to trust reality as you experience it. After all, whether or not this world is a simulation, you still have relationships, emotions, choices, and consequences. Your experiences still feel real to you, and that alone gives them meaning. Philosophers have debated responses to the brain in a vat for years. Some argue that even if you were just a brain being fed signals, the experiences you have would still count as reality for you. Others suggest that worrying about such possibilities is pointless, because there is no practical difference between living in a simulation and living in what we call the real world. If you cannot tell the difference, then maybe it does not matter. Still, the thought experiment lingers because it touches something deep in us, the desire to know what is ultimately true. So the next time you sip your coffee, scroll through your phone, or feel the sun on your face, pause for just a moment and ask yourself, how do I know this is real? Chances are you will go right back to living your life just as you should. But even entertaining the question for a minute can open your mind to the mysteries of existence. Maybe the world is exactly what it seems. Or maybe, just maybe, you are a brain in a vat, dreaming your life away. Either way, the thought makes reality feel a little more fragile, a little more precious, and a lot more fascinating. Zhuangzi's butterfly dream. Imagine this waking up one morning after having the most vivid dream of your life. In the dream, you were flying high above the ground, not in an airplane, not in a superhero cape, but as a butterfly. The wind brushed against your delicate wings, flowers seemed to call out your name, and the world looked brighter than anything you have ever seen before. Then suddenly, you open your eyes and you are back in your bed, staring at the ceiling, realizing it was just a dream. But here is the strange part. For a split second, you wonder, what if that dream was real? What if I'm actually a butterfly right now, just dreaming that I'm a human? Sounds like the start of a science fiction movie, right? But this is not Hollywood. This is philosophy. Now, we all know that dreams can be pretty weird. You can dream that you are running late for class only to realize you are wearing pajamas in public. Or you might dream about eating an entire pizza by yourself and then wake up starving. Most of the time, we laugh off our dreams and move on with our day. But here is the thing. We almost never stop to think deeply about what dreams actually mean. Why do they feel so real while we are in them? And what does that say about how we understand reality? This is where the story of Zhuangzi comes in. Zhuangzi was a Chinese philosopher who lived more than 2,000 years ago, and he gave us one of the most famous and puzzling thought experiments in history. It is called the butterfly dream. The story is very simple, yet incredibly powerful. One day, Zhuangzi dreamed that he was a butterfly, fluttering around, living freely, enjoying life as a butterfly. Then he woke up and realized he was Zhuangzi again, the philosopher. But he was confused. He did not know whether he was Zhuangzi who had dreamed of being a butterfly, or a butterfly who was now dreaming of being Zhuangzi. At first, this might sound like a fun little riddle, almost like a philosophical prank, but let us slow down and think about it. Zhuangzi is not just saying, "I had a weird dream." He is questioning the very foundation of what we call reality. If our dreams can feel just as real as our waking lives, then how do we truly know which is which? When we wake up in the morning, we assume that what we see, hear, and touch is the real world. But while we are dreaming, we assume the exact same thing. Both states feel real when we are in them. This question matters more than we realize. Think about how often we assume that the way we see the world is the way the world really is. We believe our senses, our memories, our experiences, without much hesitation. But what if they are not as reliable as we think? For example, have you ever woken up from a dream where someone was mean to you and you actually felt upset with them in real life? Or maybe you dreamed about falling and woke up with your heart racing. Your body and your emotions responded to something that was not even physically happening. That is the power of the mind. Zhuangzi's butterfly dream challenges us to think about identity as well. If he could feel completely like a butterfly in one state, and like a human philosopher in another, then who was he really? Was his true self the butterfly, the man, or both? In our own lives, we often assume we are one fixed identity. I am me, you are you, and that is that. But Zhuangzi invites us to imagine that identity might not be so stable. Maybe we are constantly shifting, shaped by our thoughts, our roles, and even our dreams. To make this even more interesting, modern science actually supports some of these questions. There have been psychological studies showing that people in dreams cannot always tell they are dreaming. In fact, while dreaming, the brain lights up in many of the same ways it does when we are awake. That is why dreams feel so convincing. Neurologists explain that the brain does not always distinguish between imagined experiences and real ones. This is why imagining yourself practicing a skill, like playing piano or shooting basketballs, can actually improve your performance in real life. The mind blurs the boundary between what is real and what is imagined. And if you think about it, the butterfly dream is not just about sleeping dreams. It can also be about the everyday illusions we live in. For example, how many of us scroll through social media and get caught up in comparing our lives to pictures that may not even reflect reality? Or how often do we convince ourselves that our job title, our grades, or our possessions define who we are? In a way, these are also dreams. They are stories we tell ourselves, and we get so lost in them that we forget to ask, is this really me? There is even a connection to popular culture. Movies like The Matrix or Inception are basically modern versions of Zhuangzi's butterfly dream. In The Matrix, the characters question whether they are living in a simulated world or the real one. In Inception, characters struggle to know whether they are dreaming or awake. Both films force us to ask the same question Zhuangzi did 2,000 years ago. How do we know what reality really is? Now here is why this matters for you. The butterfly dream is not about getting stuck in endless doubt. It is about opening our minds. Instead of clinging tightly to what we think is true or who we think we are, Zhuangzi reminds us to stay flexible. Maybe reality is not as solid as we assume. Maybe identity is more fluid than we like to admit. And maybe that is a good thing, because if life is a little bit dreamlike, then we have the freedom to imagine, to change, and to see things from new perspectives. So the next time you wake up from a dream that feels strangely real, do not just shrug it off. Take a moment to wonder, what if, in some way, that dream was just as real as your waking life? What if both states are part of the same mystery we call existence? Zhuangzi's butterfly dream does not give us a final answer. Instead, it leaves us with a question that can make us more curious, more humble, and maybe even more alive. After all, whether you are a butterfly dreaming you are human, or a human dreaming you are a butterfly, the point is the same. Life is uncertain. Reality is mysterious. And maybe, just maybe, the dream itself is where the beauty lies. Philosophical zombies. Imagine you wake up one morning, brush your teeth, pour yourself a cup of coffee, and head out the door. On your way, you wave to your neighbor, who waves back. They smile, they say good morning, and they walk off. Nothing unusual, right? But what if I told you that your neighbor might not actually have any inner experience at all? They smile, they talk, they seem perfectly normal, but inside, there is no conscious awareness happening. No inner voice, no sense of taste when they sip their coffee, no feeling of happiness or sadness. On the outside, they act just like you, but on the inside, there is nothing. That, my friend, is the strange idea of a philosophical zombie. Now, before you picture zombies from horror movies, let's clear that up. Philosophical zombies are not the kind that chase you down for your brains. They are not monsters or undead creatures. Instead, this idea comes from philosophy of mind, where people ask big questions about what it means to be conscious. The philosophical zombie is not scary in the traditional sense. It is scary because it forces us to question something we take for granted every single day, our own experience of being alive. Here is the funny thing. Most of us do not think about consciousness very much. We wake up, we feel hungry, we get stressed about work, or excited about plans with friends, and we never really pause to ask, what exactly is this feeling of being me? We might wonder how the brain works, or how memory functions, but consciousness, that mysterious sense of awareness, often hides in the background. That is exactly why philosophers bring in the zombie idea. It shocks us into realizing how strange consciousness really is. So what exactly is a philosophical zombie? In simple words, it is a being that looks and behaves exactly like a normal human being, but has no conscious experience on the inside. Think of it like a perfect actor who follows the script of life flawlessly, but has no awareness of what is going on. If you ask the zombie, "Do you like ice cream?" it will smile and say, "Yes, chocolate is my favorite." But it does not actually taste chocolate. It does not feel pleasure. It is just programmed to respond that way. Why does this idea matter? Because it points to one of the hardest problems in philosophy and neuroscience. Why do we have conscious experience at all? Scientists can explain how neurons fire, how signals travel through the brain, and how muscles move. But explaining why all that electrical activity produces the feeling of seeing the color red or the pain of stubbing your toe is a much deeper mystery. This is often called the hard problem of consciousness. And the zombie thought experiment tries to show that maybe all the physical stuff can happen without consciousness. In other words, maybe you could have a brain and body that act exactly like yours, but with no inner life. Here is why people find this both fascinating and unsettling. If a zombie can behave exactly like us, then how do we know the people around us are truly conscious? How do you know your best friend is not a zombie, perfectly mimicking emotions without feeling them? How do you know even I, the voice you are listening to right now, have any awareness at all? The only consciousness you can be absolutely sure about is your own. That is a mind-bending thought, and it makes us realize how private and mysterious our inner lives really are. To make this more relatable, think about when you're on autopilot. Maybe you drive home from school or work and suddenly realize you do not remember the last 10 minutes of the trip. You stopped at red lights, you turned corners, you signaled, and you followed all the rules, but your awareness was somewhere else. You were lost in thought. For a moment, you acted like a zombie. You functioned perfectly, but without the full presence of conscious attention. That is not exactly the same as being a philosophical zombie, but it gives you a tiny glimpse into what it might be like to act without awareness. Another real-world connection is artificial intelligence. Today, we have machines that can hold conversations, write essays, and even crack jokes. But does that mean they are conscious? Most scientists would say no. They process information, but there is no inner experience. They are more like philosophical zombies than like conscious beings. That comparison makes the idea feel much less like a faraway philosophical puzzle and much more like something we are already grappling with in technology today. One of the most famous philosophers to talk about zombies is David Chalmers, who introduced the thought experiment in the 1990s. He used it to argue that physical explanations of the brain are not enough to fully explain consciousness. According to him, even if you built a complete model of how every single neuron works, you would still be left with the mystery of why there is something it feels like to be alive. The zombie helps highlight that gap. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some philosophers think zombies are impossible. They argue that if something behaves exactly like a conscious person, then it must be conscious. In their view, behavior and consciousness cannot be separated. Others think zombies are not useful because they are too far-fetched. But whether you believe they are possible or not, zombies succeed at one thing. They make us think harder about what consciousness really is. Here is a fun way to picture it. Imagine playing a video game where the characters look and act incredibly realistic. They scream when they get hurt. They laugh when they win. They even talk about their feelings. But deep down, you know they are just pixels on a screen with no awareness. Now imagine if you were told that one of your friends might actually be like that. They respond perfectly, but inside there is nothing. That is the unsettling but fascinating power of the philosophical zombie. So what does this mean for you and me? Well, it reminds us to appreciate the strangeness of our own experience. The fact that you can hear my words right now and not only process the sounds, but actually feel what they mean inside your mind is an incredible mystery. It is something so normal that we often forget how extraordinary it is. The zombie thought experiment shakes us awake to the uniqueness of being conscious. In the end, whether zombies are possible or not, the idea sparks some of the deepest questions we can ask. What is consciousness? Why do we have it? And could there be beings out there who act like us but lack it entirely? These questions may not have clear answers yet, but they open the door to endless wonder and curiosity. So the next time you wave at your neighbor, sip your coffee, or even listen to a video like this one, pause for a moment and realize how strange and beautiful it is to be aware. Because if the zombie thought experiment teaches us anything, it is that your inner world is not guaranteed. It is something mysterious, valuable, and deeply human. The Grandfather Paradox, time travel. You are sitting at home on a Saturday night, scrolling endlessly through your phone, maybe watching videos just like this one, when suddenly a wild idea pops into your head. What if you could go back in time and stop yourself from making that one embarrassing mistake? Maybe it is that text you should never have sent, or that haircut you thought was a good idea but made you look like a rejected boy band member. We have all wished for a time machine at some point, whether to fix a cringy moment, undo a bad decision, or maybe even buy Bitcoin when it was dirt cheap. Time travel is one of those fantasies that just refuses to leave our imaginations. But here is the thing. The moment you start to think seriously about time travel, your brain runs straight into a wall called the Grandfather Paradox. Before we jump into what that actually means, let us talk about how we normally think about time. For most of us, time feels like a straight line. You wake up, brush your teeth, eat breakfast, go through your day, and eventually go to sleep. The next morning, the line continues. We usually only think about moving forward on this timeline, but when someone mentions the idea of traveling backward, that line suddenly twists and tangles like a ball of yarn. Our minds try to make sense of it, but things stop adding up. And that is exactly where the Grandfather Paradox comes in. It is one of the most famous and puzzling thought experiments in all of science and philosophy, and it has been confusing people for decades. So what is the Grandfather Paradox? Here is the idea explained as simply as possible. Imagine you build a time machine. You set the dial for a point in the past, long before you were born. You travel back in time and accidentally, or maybe on purpose, prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. That means your parent is never born, which means you are never born. And if you are never born, then you could not have traveled back in time to stop your grandparents from meeting in the first place, which means they did meet, which means you are born, which means you could go back. And the cycle continues, looping endlessly with no logical way out. That is the paradox. It is like trying to bite your own teeth or clap with one hand. The whole situation folds in on itself. Now you might be thinking, why does this matter? It is not like we have working time machines lying around in our garages. And you are right. But the reason the Grandfather Paradox matters is because it reveals something profound about how time itself might work. Time travel stories are everywhere in our movies, shows, and books. From Back to the Future, to Avengers Endgame, to countless science fiction novels, we love the idea of bending time to our will. But whenever a story involves traveling into the past, the writers always have to wrestle with this exact problem. If changing the past creates a contradiction, does that mean time travel is impossible? Or is there some clever loophole? One possible way out of the paradox is the idea that time is fixed. In this view, even if you went back, you would never actually succeed in changing events. Maybe you try to stop your grandparents from meeting, but something always gets in the way. Maybe you spill your drink, miss the moment, or even end up accidentally playing matchmaker. No matter what, history stays the same. This is sometimes called the Novikov self-consistency principle, though we do not need to worry about the fancy name. The main idea is simple. The timeline is like a movie that has already been filmed, and you cannot rewrite the script no matter how hard you try. Another idea is that of parallel universes. Think of it like this. When you go back and prevent your grandparents from meeting, you do not erase your own timeline. Instead, you create a brand new branch, a parallel universe where you are never born. But in your original universe, you still exist. In that way, there is no paradox, because the cause and effect chain stays intact in your own timeline, and the changes simply spin off into another version of reality. This is the idea that shows up in a lot of modern science fiction, because it neatly dodges the paradox and allows for dramatic storytelling without breaking logic. To see how powerful this paradox is, let us look at a real-world example of how it shapes our thinking. One of the most famous science fiction writers of all time, Ray Bradbury, wrote a short story called A Sound of Thunder. In the story, people travel back in time to hunt dinosaurs. The only rule is that they must not disturb anything in the past, because even a tiny change could ripple into the future. But of course, someone steps on a butterfly, and when they return to their own time, the world is completely changed. This story is where the term the butterfly effect comes from. While not exactly the same as the grandfather paradox, it shows the same anxiety, that messing with the past could have consequences that unravel everything we know. Scientists, philosophers, and storytellers still debate whether time travel to the past is even possible. Some argue that the laws of physics simply do not allow it. Others say that the universe might permit it, but only in very restricted ways that prevent paradoxes from ever happening. And then there are those who embrace the multiverse idea, where every possibility exists in some branch of reality. The grandfather paradox keeps us questioning not just time travel, but the very nature of cause and effect, of identity, and of what it means to exist. So the next time you wish you could hop in a time machine to fix that one awkward text message, remember this. If you could actually go back, you might end up in a logical trap with no way out. The grandfather paradox is more than just a clever puzzle. It is a reminder that some of our biggest dreams bump right up against the limits of logic itself. And while we may not have time machines yet, thinking about these paradoxes pushes scientists and philosophers to explore the deepest mysteries of the universe. Who knows? Maybe one day we will discover that the solution to the grandfather paradox is not to avoid it, but to rethink time itself. Until then, enjoy your timeline, because as far as we know, it is the only one you get. The infinite monkey theorem. Imagine sitting in a coffee shop, sipping your drink, when you overhear someone on their laptop mumbling a random string of letters. They go Q, W, E, R, T, Y, Z, P, O. Then they sigh and say, "Nope, not Shakespeare yet." You laugh because obviously typing random keys on a keyboard is not going to produce a masterpiece. But what if I told you there is actually a famous thought experiment that suggests that, given enough time, those random keystrokes could eventually form the complete works of Shakespeare? That might sound absurd, but stay with me, because it is one of the strangest, funniest, and surprisingly deep ideas in mathematics and probability. It is called the infinite monkey theorem. Now, before we jump into monkeys smashing keyboards, let's pause and think about something we all do. Have you ever tried guessing a password by brute force? Maybe you forgot your old email password and you just kept trying combinations you thought you might have used. Maybe it was your birthday, then your pet's name, then your pet's name with your birthday. Each wrong guess feels like you are just pressing random buttons in the hope that one day, eventually, you will stumble upon the right one. That frustration of endlessly trying possibilities is actually related to what the infinite monkey theorem is all about. It is the idea that randomness, given unlimited attempts, can eventually produce order. So, what exactly is this theorem? In simple terms, it says that if you had an infinite amount of time and you let a monkey randomly hit the keys on a typewriter, eventually the monkey would type every possible text that could ever be written. That means poems, song lyrics, this very script you are listening to right now. And yes, even the entire works of Shakespeare, word for word, letter for letter. It is not saying the monkey is smart or creative. It is saying that randomness, stretched over infinity, will cover every possibility. The idea might sound ridiculous at first, but that is what makes it so fascinating. Think about it like rolling a dice. If you roll a fair dice once, you might or might not get a 6. If you roll it 10 times, you have a better chance of getting a 6 at least once. But if you roll it infinitely, there is no question about it. You will eventually roll a 6, and not just once, but infinitely many times. The monkey typing scenario is like that, except instead of 6 numbers on a dice, there are dozens of letters, spaces, and punctuation marks. And instead of rolling, the monkey is smashing keys endlessly. Now, why does this matter? Why should we even care about monkeys and typewriters? The beauty of the infinite monkey theorem is that it highlights how probability and randomness work on a massive scale. It shows us that given unlimited time, even the most unlikely event becomes not only possible, but inevitable. This has big implications in fields like mathematics, physics, computer science, and even philosophy. For example, it can help us understand randomness in the stock market, the concept of infinite universes in cosmology, or the possibilities that arise in artificial intelligence. But let's make this practical and relatable. Think about those times when your phone autocorrects your message into complete nonsense. It feels random, like your phone is the monkey. But once in a while, that random autocorrect actually produces a real word, or even a sentence that kind of makes sense. If you let autocorrect run wild forever, eventually it would create entire books of coherent text. Another everyday example is streaming services. When you hit shuffle on your music app, sometimes you get the perfect playlist, and other times you get the weirdest sequence of songs. That shuffle button is basically your little pocket-sized infinite monkey theorem at work. One of the most famous real-world attempts to test this idea happened in England in the early 2000s. A group of researchers set up a computer in a zoo enclosure with 6 macaque monkeys. They wanted to see what would happen if monkeys actually had access to a keyboard. The result? Instead of typing Shakespeare, the monkeys smashed the keyboard with stones, pooped on it, and typed mostly the letter S over and over. Not exactly the literary genius people were hoping for, but the experiment was less about producing Shakespeare and more about showing how hard it actually is to get meaningful text, even with real monkeys. It also made people laugh, which is a win on its own. Still, mathematically, the theorem holds. With infinity on your side, even the impossible becomes inevitable. If you give that monkey an endless amount of time, sooner or later, it will not only write Hamlet but every text that could ever exist. It would type your favorite novel, your diary entries, even emails you have not written yet. Infinity is that powerful. And here is where the infinite monkey theorem becomes less of a joke and more of a mind bender. It makes us reflect on the nature of possibility and time. When we think about infinity, we realize that probability is not about what is likely in the short run, but what must happen in the long run. It teaches us patience and perspective. The fact that something has a tiny chance of happening does not mean it will never happen. It just means it might take longer than we can imagine. So next time you feel like something is impossible, whether it's learning a new skill, solving a tough problem, or beating your personal best at something, remember the infinite monkey theorem. If randomness itself can eventually produce Shakespeare, then persistence and effort in your own life can surely produce amazing results too. The infinite monkey theorem might sound like a silly idea at first, but it is really a doorway into understanding probability, infinity, and the strange but wonderful nature of chance. From monkeys in zoos to shuffle playlists on our phones, this concept reminds us that the universe is full of possibilities, no matter how unlikely they seem. And who knows, maybe right now, somewhere out there, a monkey really is typing the words to be or not to be. If your mind wandered through tonight's thought experiments and you'd like to dive even deeper, don't stop here. Hit subscribe to join us for more journeys into philosophy, psychology, and the mysteries of the universe. And if this video helped you drift into wonder or into sleep, leave a like so we know to keep making more. For now, rest easy, and when you wake, there's a whole library of deep sleep theory waiting for you.